But I'm glad you guys had a good delay day. Today, okay, help me. Last week, we learned about like anatomy and physiology of plants. Do you guys remember the 6 different parts of the plant, like the main parts of the plant?
I haven't read it.
The xylem.
What?
The xylem. Xylem.
Okay, but what's that a part of? Like, think bigger. Anybody got it? The roots, the stem, the leaf, right? The flower, and the fruit and the seeds. And we watched a super mind-blowing video about how apples come from flowers. And we tore flowers apart. And which I'm also gonna make that video today for any of you who were at home, because I totally forgot to record class that day. Yeah, and how they all grow from that, and then how the roots feed the stem, and how the people up in the penthouse of the leaf soak up all the sun and all the energy from the sun, and they put all the food down with like the peasants in the basement, right, to store it for them for later. Last week was crazy. Okay, so we're gonna move on from that just a little bit today, and we're going to learn the last 2 things, which we're gonna do like a week-long experiment with these that we're gonna start setting up tomorrow. So this is like important information to know for the next week. So today we're gonna talk about how plants reproduce. Okay, and we're also going to talk about not nearly as awkward as when I had to do the livestock reproduction over Zoom last year. That was a little more, I won't say scandalous than the plants, but a little different. But the biggest thing that we're going to talk about today is the germination factor. So what does a plant need to be able to germinate? Does anybody remember last week when we talked about what the word germinate means? Yeah, this is good.
Crib. Hold on. Okay, I don't know what's happening. Germinate. It stores food for the young embryo to start its growth for when it germinates.
Yeah. So
Something.
germination. Okay, look at little Miss Wallace Learning Academy here. When a plant germinates, that is basically saying that the seed is like sprouting open and starting to grow. Like it is literally the process of that seed going meh, and a little plant coming out of it. So when we talked about the seed, actual like the seed anatomy, we talked about the fact that it has a seed coat that like holds everything together. There's the embryo in there, which is actually what's going to be, it's like a little plant fetus, right? It's going to become the plant. And then there's also that endosperm that is that little food sac for like the little hibernating bear in his cave, right? We equate it to like the embryo is a little bear that's hibernating, and the endosperm is all the food that it stored up to get itself through the winter, right? So it keeps that little food storage so that it can be dormant. Okay, important word for germinating is dormant. And that just means that like it's chilling, like it's chilling, it's not doing anything, it's not growing, it's alive, but it's hibernating, right? It's just waiting for all the factors that it needs to be able to grow. When a seed is still able to grow, like it's not too old, it's what we call viable. So a viable plant means that it has potential to be life, like it has potential to be alive. So if the plant is viable, that's saying that like the endosperm has not worn out, like it's not rotted. Like if we give that seed the things that it needs to grow, it is going to be able to grow into a plant. When a seed is no longer viable, that means that even if we put it in the proper conditions, that seed has kind of expired and it's not going to actually grow into anything anymore. Does that make sense? So we have germinating, if it's dormant, and if it's viable are kind of the two. We want it to be dormant, we want it to be viable. When we give it all the conditions that it needs to grow, if it is dormant and viable, then it will turn into a plant. With me so far? Okay. So talking about types of reproduction just super quick. And I know I'm fully aware that like none of you have your books with you because one, most of you leave them here. Two, Sam, do you have your book with you? What a woman. Sam gets the gold star for the day. But most of you, well aware that you do not have your books with you. So we're just kind of going to talk about this, and I'm going to give you guys the lowdown on what you need to email me to count for today's like task. And then you'll do that, and then when we come back tomorrow, we'll kind of retouch base on this stuff. But Sam, right after your seed notes, like where we drew the flower, there should be a page that says 2 types of reproduction, and it'll say germination about halfway down. And that's the page that we're going to be on. And I'm looking at an old book, so I don't know exactly what page that is, but yeah.
For us, it's 167.
167. What a woman. You go. Gold star. So if you want to follow along with this, otherwise it's just going to kind of be story time for you guys for a second. And I'm going to tell you, if you don't have your book, I'm going to let you know when that's like something that you need to jot down to complete today's task. Okay. So going through this, the 2 different types of reproduction, and this is just super important. We're going to just touch on this really quick so that reproduction, or so that germination makes sense. But a plant can use sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. So that's the 1 and the 2. Is 1 is sexual reproduction, 2 is asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is the union of the egg and the sperm, right? Which in plant lingo is the ovule and the pollen, right? We talked about pollen being plant sperm and the ovule being a little plant egg, right? And the bee brings them together. So it's the union of the egg and the sperm, or the ovule and the pollen, resulting in a seed in the ovary. So all those little ovules that are down in the ovary of that flower, and once it's fertilized, those little ovules turn into little baby seeds sitting in the plant ovary. Okay, so then that little plant ovary grows like a little pregnant belly and makes fruits or makes seeds or whatever it is, depending on the plant. This may involve the floral plants of 1 or 2 parents. So we also talked about the fact that plants can have both male and female reproductive parts. So if it's a plant that has both, then gold star for them, right? They have all the parts that they need right there. If it's a type of plant that only has 1, where there is a male and a female tree, there's something like the ginkgo trees that we learned about in the fall. They actually have there's a male and a female ginkgo tree. They don't have both parts. So one of them actually lets off these like seed nuts that are super smelly when you crush them and step on them on your feet. But in that case, you would need both to be able to bring like the pollen from one to the ovary of the other to reproduce. Advantages of natural or of sexual reproduction: it's more natural and it's a cheaper option. If you're into like, if you have a nursery and you're growing your own plants, the bee can do that for you, right? And bada bing, bada boom, you have little plants. The second type is asexual reproduction, and that is when only one parent plant duplicates itself, with the new plant being an exact clone of the original, using the vegetative parts of the plant. So the vegetative parts of the plant would be like the stem, the root, the leaf, okay? So that's where, if you guys have ever heard about like stem cell, right? Like you're literally taking the cells from the stem and you're able to duplicate that plant, okay? So that's more something that if you're duplicating those, that's not really something that's gonna happen. It could happen naturally in nature, but a lot of times that's more like lab-based. A hybrid then is something that is basically a crossbreed, okay? So like blue butt hogs, if you guys have ever seen them at the fair, like the white ones that have like the blue bottoms, the breed is literally called a blue butt because they have blue butts. Creative. But that's an example of a crossbreed. It's kind of come to be its own recognized breed now, but it started as just a mix between a Hampshire and any white hog. So that could also be called a hybrid. Hybrids is used a little bit more in the plant industry than it is in the animal industry. But it's basically by taking, let's say this isn't like common, but like a carnation and a rose, and we want to make our carose, right? We're gonna make this new flower, so we're gonna crossbreed these two plants. Okay, that's like the extreme example of that. Now they can do that within, like, if you have a white carnation and a red carnation, like eventually you breed those and you get a pink carnation. Like another example of what that could be. Hybrid vigor, okay, VIGOR, is when those hybrid plants tend to be stronger and survive better than their purebred version. So a reason that we would do this a lot, and where you're gonna see this a lot in the plant industry, is in like row crops. So if you think about like Beck's Hybrids, a plant company like that, that's making seeds, they're gonna have a variety of corn. And this is where we're talking about like actual stuff that's happening with hybrids in the plant industry. This is a better example, is when we have a variety of corn that maybe is resistant to a certain type of herbicide that we want to spray. And we have this variety of corn that has like 100 kernels, or an extreme amount of kernels on the ear. We can breed those two types of corn together. So eventually down the road, we're going to have a variety of corn that has a lot of kernels on its ear and is also resistant to this type of spray. So we're getting those varieties that eventually are going to be a stronger plant because we've narrowed down those traits that we really liked and we've bred those together to try and make like a super plant. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where we're talking with reproduction, to where we can get those seeds. But we're going to move on to what we're really going to focus on for the next week, which is germination. So when we're talking about germination, again, that is the ability of the seed being this little baby hibernating bear and eventually going meh, and a little seed coming up out of it. Okay, so the seed will start to sprout when it's germinating. The seed will start to sprout and the plant will grow. And that's like literally germination. I'm saying that slow because that's in the notes, and I know some of you have the book. So the seed will start to sprout and the plant will grow. The seeds are better when the plant is specifically bred for seed production. Okay. Seeds from plants being raised for grain are often smaller and improperly handled or stored. Okay. So seeds are better when the plant is specifically bred for seed production. Seeds from plants being raised for grain are often smaller and improperly handled or stored. So let's think about a cornfield, okay? If I just have a cornfield and I'm gonna harvest that corn and I'm gonna take it to the elevator, I'm gonna save it, or I'm gonna sell it as grain, then that corn is going to be eaten by livestock more than likely, right? That's what it's being sold for. So that's the end of that kernel's life, right? It's gonna be digested by a cow or a pig or whatever. See you later. That's fine. And like, if that corn gets in the ground, like corn can grow, but it's not being handled and it's not being treated to be like super good at that, right? Its job is to be eaten by an animal. There are people who are contracted and they will actually raise seed corn. So you guys could hypothetically drive past a field of corn that is not actually going to be sold and eaten by animals. That corn is being raised to be replanted the next year, right? Because a kernel on an ear of corn, get my corn that made me TikTok famous, okay? My kernel that's on an ear of corn, like this is a corn seed, right? Like when you get corn seed in a package, like when you got your micro gardens last year, that's what your corn seed looked like, right? It was a kernel of corn. So sometimes these kernels are stripped off, the kernels are taken off the ear of corn and it's just fed to livestock. Sometimes it's seed that is specifically planted to be a good variety of corn. And then also it's handled super gently so that you don't like totally destroy it, and then all these seeds are viable. So those are then bagged and sold back to farmers the next year to plant as field corn as grain for livestock. Okay, so it's kind of crazy to think that like you might drive past a full field of corn that's never going to be eaten, that's just being raised to be replanted the next year. Like the forward thinkingness of that like thinking, okay, we need to raise seed too, is kind of cool, I think. Did you guys know that about corn, that they specifically raise seed corn? crazy. So when we're talking about germination and we're talking about those seeds that have been specifically been grown to be seeds, like that is their life's purpose. Think like a little society that they make these like cartoons about, like Inside Out and like Soul, those new Disney movies where it's like what's happening inside your brain, right? So think about that from like a seed industry, or like the bee movie where like this is my job, like this is my life's purpose, is that some of these little kernels are like, I'm meant to be a seed. This is my job. Like I want to go to the seed place. Sorry, super cheesy apparently when I get a lot of sleep. But there are four, like for that little seed to fulfill its life purpose and be like, okay, I got to go grow into a plant now, is it has to be in the right environment. All right. If I just set this seed here on my desk, it's not ever going to grow into a plant. Okay. Because it doesn't have the things that it needs to survive. Okay. It doesn't have the things that it needs to be able to germinate. It's viable. Okay. So it could turn into life if it's given those things, but it's dormant right now. So it's not going to do anything until it's given those factors that it needs. Okay. So this is where things get crazy and super important for today, is that we're talking about those different germination factors, those 4 different things that a plant needs to grow. Okay. So factors that must be right for effective germination. Does anybody have ideas as to what they are? What does the seed need to actually turn into life?
I don't know.
If you get a seed of flowers at your house, what do you need to do to it? It needs the sun, okay? What is it getting from the sun? Like more directly. Like if I have a plant inside, it's not seeing the sun and it can grow. It's getting light, super important, right? You can't grow a plant in the darkness. What else does it get? Okay, it gets nutrients from the sun, that's important, but not like one of these.
Water?
It needs water, yes. It's thirsty, needs to drink. What else does it need? 2 more things. It needs light, it needs water. What else can it get from the sun? Do seeds grow in the winter? So what's it need from the sun? Okay, it could get energy, but what's it get energy from? It needs to be warm, right? Yes, heat. So it has to be a specific temperature for the seeds to be able to germinate. It can't germinate in freezing temperatures. So we need temperature, we need light, we need air. Oh, wait. I just spoiled it for you. You said water. We need air. Air is the 4th one. So the 4 things that we need for plants to germinate, okay, are water, air, light, and temperature. Okay, so when we're talking about a good, and what it needs in this, what if we give it like this little tiny seed? What if I put it in 40 ounces of water? What's it gonna do? Can it swim? What's gonna happen? What's gonna happen to the poor little seed? It's not gonna grow in 40. No, it's gonna drown, okay? It's gonna have way too much water. So it could have way too much. What if we don't give it any water at all? What's it gonna do? What if we don't give it any water? It's gonna dry out, right? So we need a good, I want you to think of this little tiny kernel as Goldilocks, okay? Like Goldilocks and the 3 little bears. So it needs a good, happy medium. So we call that, scientifically is called a germination medium. Okay, so a good germination medium is important for these 4 conditions. So Goldilocks went into that house and one bed was way too hard and the other one was way too soft, but the 3rd one was just right. That porridge, one bowl was way too hot. Oops. One bowl was way too cold, but the other one was just right. This little Goldilocks of a seed needs everything to be just right for it to grow. It needs a good medium, okay? So a viable seed is alive and capable of germinating. and the germination rate is how much the percent of seeds that germinate. So the germination rate, when we're talking about that outside of these conditions, is saying if I have 10 seeds and 8 of them germinate when put in the proper conditions, what germination rate would that be? If I have 10 seeds and I put them all in the right conditions and 8 of them germinate, what would my germination rate be? It's a percentage. 80%, yes, fantastic. So that germination rate is, we want a good germination rate on our seeds to make sure that they're all going to be alive. So if we're talking about these 4 germination factors, and this is going to lead into your task for today, the absorption of water into a plant, and this is really fun, and even if you don't turn your mics on, everybody say this because it's such a fun word. The absorption of water into a plant is known as imbibition. Say imbibition. It's so fun to say. Imbibition. So that is, oh, sorry, leave it there. That is water taking in a plant. It's called imbibition. This allows for the seed to fill its cells with water, allowing it to break open into germination with other favorable conditions. So as long as it has everything else going on, basically it's like a water balloon that you fill way too full. So if you've ever put a water balloon underneath the faucet, right, and you let it fill, what eventually happens to it? It bursts open. So imbibition allows that cell, those waters, to take in all of that, and eventually that's what helps the egg crack open, the cell crack open, the seed crack open, so that the little plant can grow out, okay? Too much water could result in what's called seed rot, okay? You don't want that, seed rot. Not enough water could result in the death of the young embryo because it dies of thirst. Super sad. Okay. If the seed coat is not penetrable, a process called scarifying may be necessary. And this is basically what we do to nick the seed with a little scalpel or a knife to give it a little boost, right? So if the seed coat is super hard, maybe it's an older seed or something, and it's not doing a great job of breaking open, is you can basically give it a little poke, and that just helps the water get in and helps it break open. So that's what's called scarifying, where sometimes some seed companies will do that, is they'll take all their little seeds and they'll just take a needle and just like poke them. And then they don't have quite the dormant life, like they're not gonna last as long if you don't plant them right away, but when they do plant, they're gonna take off quicker, okay? So that's all having to do with water. When we talk about air, the intake and release of air in and out of the plant is called respiration. Okay, so that's just the same as us breathing. We call that respiration, right? So plants breathe too, and seeds breathe too. So that process of respiration, it's important that the seed be placed in a good soil or media that is loose and well drained, so that oxygen can move in and out. If you pack that soil around that seed, it's gonna be like you're being buried alive and you can't breathe, right? So if you pack that soil too hard around those seeds, then they can't breathe, they can't respirate, and they're not going to germinate because they can't take in that CO2, okay? And they can't let out oxygen. So that's super important, that they're able to get that air, whether they're in soil or whether they're not in soil. Okay, fun fact, did we say that soil is necessary for germination? No, we did not, right? You do not have to have soil to grow a little plant. You can put on a wet paper towel. As long as it has these 4 germination factors, it's gonna grow. So it does get nutrients from the soil, but you don't necessarily need soil, and we'll get into hydroponics and stuff like that later in your ag careers. The third thing that these plants need is light, right? So the amount of light necessary is dependent on the species of seed. Some seeds are what we call shade tolerant, while others need a bunch of light. So if you've ever helped your mom or your parents or your grandparents or whatever plant flowers, like out in the flower bed, there's some packets that'll say this one can be planted in the shade, and there's some that'll say this needs full sun. So that's like the really high maintenance seeds that need to be in full sun all day long. And if they're in the shade, then they're not going to get enough light to germinate and grow. So it depends really heavily on the variety of seed, on how much light that seed needs. The last thing that a seed needs to grow is temperature. So again, this varies on the species of seed. The only way to control the temperature when handling agronomic crops with that one because it's weird. Agronomic crops is to plant when the ground is warm. So if we are planting in a greenhouse, right, and we're going to grow some tomatoes or some strawberries in a greenhouse, we can plant those suckers whenever, right, because we can control the temperature within that greenhouse. If we're planting a field of corn outside, we can't control the temperature of the earth, right? We don't have that power. So the only way to do that is to plant when it's warm out, so that it has the temperature it needs to grow. That's why a lot of farmers get really nervous when there's like a late frost in like April, is because they need that temperature to grow. So if they plant that seed and then the ground freezes, those seeds could also freeze, and then they have to replant, and they're out a whole bunch of money to have to pay for double the amount of seed. Okay, does that make sense? So it's really important that when they're planting, they're watching that weather and hoping that the ground's not going to refreeze, that there's not a really heavy frost right after they plant, and then that seed gets too cold and it never germinates and grows. Okay, so the only way to when we're talking about agronomy, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, all that stuff, there's winter varieties of wheat that you can plant when it's cold, but most of the time it's just to plant when it's warm outside and hope that there's not a big freeze or a big rain. If you guys have ever heard of people like when they plant their seeds and then a huge rain comes through for like a whole week and it drowns out a lot of their plants, and then they also have to replant, which costs money. So the only way we can control temperatures outside is to play with the seasons. So those 4 things, water, air, light, and temperature, are what we need for a seed to grow. Does anybody have any questions about those things? This was like a speed training.
Can you re-go over the water part?
Yeah. So the absorption of water into a plant is called imbibition. Okay. So that is basically just like when the seed is a little sponge and it's soaking in all that water. Okay. It's called imbibition. So this allows for the seed to fill its cells with water, allowing the seed to break open into germination with other favorable conditions. So as long as it is filled with water and it has the appropriate amount of air, the appropriate amount of light, and the warm enough temperature, like just the water isn't going to do it, but if it has all those other things, then it's going to be able to grow and flourish. If you have too much water, you could have seed rot. Okay, so ROT, it would just rot out. Like it's in the water for too long. Like when you turn pruny in the water, think of a seed doing that, but before it's alive. So then it's just like DRT, right? Dead right there. Not enough water could result in death of the young embryo. If you think it like crawling through the desert, like grasping for air, hallucinating, seeing a little island, I don't know. But it's just too thirsty, right? You didn't give it enough water. If the seed coat is not penetrable, a process called scarifying could be used. And that's like going through and, like I said, kind of nicking the seed with a needle or like with a scalpel. But again, that seed doesn't last too long after you do that because you've broken its protective barrier. You've broken its seed coat. So that's great to like help the germinating process, but also if you do that and then you don't plant it for a year, your germination rate is going to be like 15% maybe. Okay, so not that many of those seeds are going to survive that for a long time. Does that help?
Yes.
Cool. So today, I'm going to put this video on the Google Classroom. So if you watched it live, congrats, you just knocked out a big part of that. If you didn't watch it live, you should be watching this now, maybe. If you did watch it live and you're like super confused, you can always go back and watch bits and pieces of it later. So today, what I want you to do, if you just finished it, if you're just watching it later, if you just finished it live, whatever, I want you to, and I'm going to put this on the virtual classroom, your task for today is that you need to compose an email from me. So go to your email, create a new email, and in that email, you're going to send it to ag.works@cardington.k12.oh.us. So not myaaron.wallet, but ag.work. And you're going to send me a list of the 4 germination factors. So that should be super easy, right? Water, air, light, and temperature. Okay, so you're literally just listing those suckers so that I know that you watched this. The other thing that I want you to do, and this is what's going to lead into our experiment, and it's going to give you a head start coming into it tomorrow, is I want you to think Goldilocks and the 3 Bears story time, but about germination factors. So I want you to give me 3 mediums, 3 ways that you could vary each of those factors. Okay, so if we were to do an experiment, what are 3 different ways that we could vary light, right? We could put a seed in complete darkness. We could put a seed in like a false light, or we could put it in the sun or under like a grow light. Okay, so you see how those are 3 different ways that we're like making different variables of light, like 3 ways that we can change that up. So then what are 3 different mediums of like extreme, middle, low, okay, for each of these different things? So what is an extreme, middle, low of water? What is an extreme, middle, low of air? And what is an extreme, middle, low of temperature? Okay, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to build an experiment the next couple days where you guys are actually going to get corn and soybean seeds. We're going to set them up in the classroom. You're going to be assigned a germination factor. You're going to find 3 different ways that you can mix, like vary that factor. And then we're going to chart and watching these seeds that we put in those different environments and how that affects their growth. That sounds like a lot. It's not going to be as complicated as it sounds, but it's going to be really cool. So what I want for you guys to do today is literally just write me an email that has those 4 things listed. So water, air, light, and temperature. And underneath each of those, give me a heavy, medium, light way that you can vary those, that you could vary that factor if you were going to grow a plant. You guys have questions? Did you super love learning about germination today? Seeds are cool. Fish are friends, not food. Well, I loved seeing you. That's all I have for you today, but I'm so excited to see you tomorrow. And I hope you guys have a great day. And I'm going to stop recording now, but you guys can stick around for a minute.